Good afternoon. Welcome. We'll get started in this afternoon sessions of our first day of our 2022. Welcome again, and I hope your lunch went well. I hope you have renewed energies because, as I was saying before, this afternoon we have very interesting sessions where we'll be delving into interesting and also controversial issues such as speculation and gentrification. We will start with Andrei Quintiá, who will be telling us about the rents in Europe and the methods of regulation against speculation. Andrei is a post-PhD researcher in the University of Law at the University of Groningen. As a lawyer, he will contribute with a necessary and complementary vision. Those of us who are more linked to architecture and construction heard a more technical overview this morning. And Andrei Quintiá will be talking about vulnerability in with regards to the rents in Europe and regulations against speculation, methodologies for regulating rents, how to see them applied in the different examples of different European cities. Therefore, we can welcome Andrei with a big round of applause. Thank you, Andrei.
Bien, muchas gracias.
Thanks a lot. It is a pleasure to have spaces like this one in order to seriously debate and to work on relevant issues, important issues such as housing. It's always been an important issue, but lately it's made more visible because of the need to develop public policies, solid policies that might integrate all social actors and social agents possible in the equation. I will be talking about regulation against speculation on rent in Europe. Regulation of rents, which has been in the lookout of citizens, politicians, and the debates in Europe. I would like to share with you today a series of data, reflections, which I think would be interesting, or that can help us come closer to these debates. These debates on the rent and the need to regulate rent are not produced in a vacuum. They are emerging in a context of housing crisis and economic stagnancy. According to Eurostat data, there is a trend to ongoing growth to the prices of rent since 2010. Microdata, the average of the EU member states. If we analyze this data in a more disaggregated way, without individualizing the analysis, we would see that in some of the metropolitan and urban areas, the growth not only is sustained, but also exponential, or it has been exponential at some moments, and not according, not, but decoupled from the wages and the salaries of people, uncoupled or disconnected from that, which has meant that some more vulnerable groups that have been forced to rent a housing because they don't have enough money to buy their own housing. And this is certainly the case in Spain. They also don't have a social alternative where they can come to. As a solution to this problem, the European Parliament came up with Resolution number 21 from January 2021, pointing at a context of ongoing growth of the housing prices. 22 member states of the European Union, especially in the urban areas. But the report was also gathering the negative impact that this process had among some families in a situation of vulnerability. According to this report, according to this resolution, this decision, 38% of households were spending more than the 38%, no, 40% of their available rent in housing. If we look at this data more individually, these percentages are higher than 40%. And this is a problem, of course, because the increase in the effort, the economic effort put in rent, will take the money away from other needs that need to be covered as well. Families running in risk of social exclusion and poverty have enormous difficulties as a consequence of this excessive offer to face basic expenses like housing, food, education, etc. Moreover, this decision was pointing at something important as well. This touchy and delicate situation could even worsen in a situation of economic crisis. A year after this decision, we saw how relevant this decision was in a context of an energetic crisis, of life costs becoming more and more expensive. The situation of some families could become especially vulnerable. What to do with this? If we have a affordable housing crisis, we need to promote affordable housing. Some of the traditional tools to tackle this problem have been the promotion of private housing, which has been a technique that has basically been worked on in Spain, enabling the development of private housing in order to introduce more often in the market and therefore stabilize or trying to stabilize prices. In other states, this tool has been complemented by other strategies like the building of public housings at affordable prices in the market, which obviously will offer an affordable price housing, but as an alternative. And another tool has been the collaboration between the public sector and some actors of the private sector which are interested in developing affordable housing with social criteria addressed at vulnerable groups at affordable prices. But what happens meanwhile? What happens in states such as Spain, where there is no social housing, where we are seeing between 1 and 2% only of a total stock of buildings are social. So building housing blocks takes time. Some people find themselves in situations where they need to tackle the ending of a contract, for example, after a month, and then a month after, they need to find a new contract. What do we do in this context? About this problem, which has many legal implications, the Economic and Social European Committee issued a decision saying that in case some state could not cover the needs of their citizens in terms of housing, they should use a mechanism of public intervention. And that was a directive taken by the Economic and Social European Committee. In this case, the access to a housing which will be affordable and will have dignity, conditions of dignity. In this context, debates have arisen about the need to regulate prices of rents. And in this context, for example, debates have arisen which have resulted in the land law in France in 2018 or the approval by the Berlin Parliament or in Catalonia of the 2020 laws. However, What are we talking about when we talk about regulating? What are we referring to exactly by regulation? What do we mean by regulation exactly? In the framework of these debates, the concept of regulation or regulation of rent has sometimes been used in a generalist way, in some occasions, and sometimes even in an ambiguous way, pushing those debates in a kind of binary tension between regulating yes or no, forgetting the whole complexity of the behind this issue. Many times regulation has been defined as a kind of univocal concept, a monist concept, which we could perfectly see and distinguish at the moment where it is, where we can be distinguished, as if the concept of regulation could be the same as a legal ordainment. But that is not. This nothing further from the truth. I would like to spend the next few minutes of my presentation to reason or argue why I think this statement is not true and how it would be advisable to acknowledge the complexity of these issues. In English, we are talking about rent controls. Rent controls, the establishment of norms to limit the freedoms of the different parts, not to regulate rent. These measures are not strange or foreign to us in our close environment. This is a map showing the results by Konstantin Hanovili on different measures of rent control regarding the limitation of rent prices for the parties in the world. You can see how the yellow and maroon colors are showing us the measures of rent control prices. In the Western European context, this is a common measure. In Spain and in France, for example, it's nothing. There's nothing new about it. Despite its history, its long history, empirical evidence has found some externalities in its application. It is, for example, well known that it has had an impact. Some modalities of this kind of policies have had an effect on the offer because of the reduction of number of rental housing or because of the reduction of construction. There has been a maintenance, a lower maintenance of buildings. Investors can have a decreased interest in maintenance of these housings and also a reduced efficiency of this housing. However, these effects are not homogeneous and they are not produced in all contexts, nor with the same intensity. The same economic literature has pointed at some of these externalities as only being a reality in certain contexts. They are not always produced with the same intensity. They don't always go hand in hand together. The same economic literature is pointing at the effects of these measures, which depend to a great extent of the institutional context, the policies that are being applied, the ordainment, and the socioeconomic context. It is not the same to have a state where rent is the main tenancy form than other states where, in the case of Spain, our main housing system is ownership, and the rental market is a minority market. If we examine through a comparative analysis the regulations of rent in Europe, we can extract three main conclusions from it. The first, there is a broad variety of regulatory techniques. There is no such one only model of regulation. Second, regulation and its effects are strongly related to the institutional context of public policies and normative policies of the context where they are developed. And that makes sense. The imposition of a limit to the renewal or the revision of rent during the term of the contract will not have the same consequences in a state where the contracts are undefined than in a state when the contracts are 3 to 5 year rental contracts. There is also some socio-economical there are also some social economical factors to be borne in mind. There's a strong relationship between the rental market and this socio-economical context. It's not the same to have social housing, which is acting as a compensation in a country where all the rental and ownership levels are similar. Therefore, the measures are varied and they can be very different depending on the economic and social context. How do we classify these measures? In the first time, the criteria proposed by the economic literature of normative generations would be proposed. This criteria was born as a chronological criteria. Nowadays, it's used as a qualitative criteria. Gen there's a level of intensity being regulate, and the controls of first generation will be those regulations that are most intensive, those regulations where greater obligations are imposed on the parties when it comes to determining the rents. So there are greater limitations. For example, the establishment of maximum limits. Something as simple as saying rents cannot raise more than 50 euro a month. Also, second or even third generation controls are being implemented, like in Spain, where limits are applied on the revision of the price of rent during the time of the contract, when the contract is in force. But there are also other variants based on the variations of the market. Sometimes maximum limits are flexible. But if we want to carry out an in-depth analysis of the consequences of this is not enough. If we want to analyze rents in depth, we should analyze also its scope of application. What is regulated exactly? What are the contracts that are being regulated? It's not the same to establish a norm with effects on all the rental contracts, especially some kinds of rental contracts. And it can be seem obvious, but it isn't. In Europe, we have two big models. A universalist model. There isn't a purely universal model that will regulate all of the rents. The Scandinavian model is opting for a universalist model where a great type of contracts is being regulated. It's starting from a different concept of what contract is and its social function, and it falls within a specific public housing concept in Scandinavia. In the rest of European countries, we have mainly selective mechanisms. Some specific kinds of contracts are selected in order to regulate them. The main criteria is the geographic, but it's not homogeneous, even if it's the main one. There are different techniques to ascertain what market areas are being regulated. But this technique is not a homogeneous model. It has different criteria, and different criteria used in order to define what dense market is. through the increase of the price of rents and or the increase of price in comparison to the increase of social rents. In France, recently, a criteria has been established to select those areas where there's a knowledge in a low level of development of the private market. So there is no evidence that the level of the offer is going to increase. There are other criteria that have been applied, usually compensate, making up for the geographical criteria or factor. However, for example, in Austria, there's only one criteria being applied, at one only typological criteria, which is submitting some specific types of housing to regulation, which benefited from state subsidies for regulation. So it's focusing on a specific moment where there was a massive rehabilitation of housing, which affected some of the sectors, some of the areas of Vienna, and the owners benefited from this regulation. The state tried to distribute this benefits which came as a result of this regulation. We can go deeper into this. Besides determining what we understand by subjective scope, we can try to classify regulations bearing in mind which are the techniques that are being used in order to limit the price of rent. So that is how do we tell the parts that they can get there. A usual or common mechanism present in the Dutch law is to link a fixed rent to the former contract. Also to increase the value of the cost so that the owners will get a small benefit from that, or even the collective negotiation. Collective negotiation is applied in Sweden. The tenants will negotiate through the trade unions together with the owners. And it will be the collective negotiations that will decide what the prices are going to be. Also, the market price index was present in the Catalan regulation and in the current German and Berlin regulation. There are even differences in the way this index is being determined. Some indexes were built only by market criteria, some other objective, it was more objective criteria and different criteria, combined criteria as well. In order to finish this compared analysis, another differentiation that we can find in the different measures implemented in Europe is warranties. Which are the guarantees that regulation is offering the tenants in the application of this regulation? We can establish a price. We can establish some limits to the evolution of prices. But what happens if this doesn't happen? It's a very important question. The regulations applied in Europe fundamentally are using two mechanisms. A procedural one, where the tenants are being granted the right to go to specific courts to denounce illegality, and others are you doing it through the administration powers, inspection and control of the market, and the consecutive imposition of a sanction in case and a breach of the regulation is detected. This guarantee part is quite important. Let's imagine you're celebrating a contract, and this contract is above the price fixed by the rent. Imagine the law. In order to control the compliance with the law, we'll understand as a unique control mechanism, the possibility that you should be the one to denounce the situation. You're going to get mad with your landlord or landlady. You're going to ruin that contract that it took you so long to find. The imposition or provision of administrative powers has an important role to play in this kind of regulations. There are a lot of differences between the models of regulations applied in Europe. These are diverse, varied mechanisms that depend on their context, juridical, social, and economical, but they all have something in common. The regulation of the rent prices limits the ownership of the housing according to the general interest. And the general interest will be the protection of the right to housing, and in some specific cases, the right to housing for people in situations of vulnerability. This reality has been gathered by the jurisprudence of Human Rights Tribunal in their numerous jurisprudence on the regulation of Cambridge to 1999, with a series of interpretative criteria that will allow us to analyze these measures in more depth. According to the Human Rights European Tribunal, the regulations of rents are proportional and fair according to the limitation of the social function of the housing when they are, in the first place, respectful with the content of right to property. What does the tribunal understand by property? Economic return. The tribunal understands that retribution, once applied, should allow the owners to obtain a certain return, covering the costs and an economic value or return. This return should be appropriate and proportional because of three measures. According to three measures, the interest, the general interest, the proportional character, that they will be adequate or appropriate to the goals that are pursued in an appropriate way. And third, maybe more fundamental than the others, they should be fundamental. A balance of the costs. So Europe understands that the distribution should be balanced according to the housing policies. The regulation of the rent, therefore, cannot be the only housing policy by the government. It cannot be only on the shoulders of the owners to pay for the cost of social housing. Normally, there is a balanced redistribution, and the tribunal has mentioned a system where there's a system, different combined system of policies which will make up for these limitations imposed by the tribunal, an environment of housing policies where also there will be policies of negotiations with private actors could be compatible, therefore, with this interpretation. Finally, I would like to launch three ideas. The first, when speaking about rent control policies, we're referring to policies aimed at giving an answer to situations of social emergency, giving an answer to people who are seeing how their day-to-day life is being harmed in a strong way. Second, there is no such thing as regulation for everything or everyone. The results of this research that have been done on the application of a certain measure in a country are not necessarily applicable to another country. So it is a complex situation. And this complexity needs to be acknowledged in order to carry out an analysis of the measures that will be more proportionate, more balanced, and which will allow us to understand what we understand by measures of compatible control. And this will allow us to understand the proportionality of the public intervention. Thank you very much.
Moltes gràcies.
Thank you, Andrei, for introducing the theoretical basis for a regulation of rents. And in order to open this new dimension of the forum, the new political dimensions, we are aware that this is a very complex question that needs to be tackled from different experiences and perspectives.